Fire moves faster than people expect. A wildfire in heavy timber, driven by wind, crowning through the treetops where the flames leap from tree to tree without touching the ground, can travel at speeds that outrun horses. One moment the fire is a distant glow on a far ridge. The next moment it is everywhere, surrounding you, consuming the oxygen you need to breathe, turning the air itself into something that burns your lungs with every gasp. People who have never seen a forest fire think of it as something you can outrun. People who have seen a forest fire know that sometimes you cannot run. Sometimes the only survival is shelter, and shelter from fire requires something that fire cannot penetrate. Stone does not burn. This seems obvious when stated plainly, but the implications are not obvious at all. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, which means that a stone-lined space can remain cool for hours or even days while fire rages around it. Stone does not produce smoke or toxic gases when heated, unlike wood that releases carbon monoxide and other poisons as it burns. Stone can be fitted together to create walls and ceilings that block radiant heat, that stop embers, that provide a barrier between the world that is burning and the space that must not burn. A cave lined with stone, properly ventilated to prevent smoke infiltration, can shelter people through a firestorm that kills everything on the surface. Emmett Cole learned this at the age of 10 in the worst possible way. He learned it by watching his family die. The fire of 1888 came in August, during a summer so dry that the creeks had stopped running and the grass crunched underfoot like paper. It started from a lightning strike on the ridge above Spruce Valley, and within hours it had grown into a monster that consumed everything in its path. The Cole family had a cabin at the upper end of the valley, surrounded by timber that Emmett's father logged for the Blackwood mill. When the fire came, they had perhaps 20 minutes of warning, 20 minutes to gather what they could and flee down the valley toward the river where they might find safety. They did not make it. The fire moved faster than anyone expected, cutting off the road, surrounding the family before they had traveled half a mile. Emmett's father tried to find another route. Emmett's mother tried to shield the younger children with her body. Emmett, the oldest at 10 years old, did the only thing he could think to do. He ran for the creek bed, threw himself into the shallow water that remained, and pressed his face into the mud while the fire passed over him. He survived because water does not burn, and mud does not burn, and the creek bed was low enough that the worst of the heat passed above him. He survived with burns on his arm where he had not submerged fast enough, with lungs scarred by smoke, with memories that would never leave him. He survived, and his parents did not, and his 2 younger sisters did not. And when he crawled out of the creek bed after the fire had passed, he found himself alone in a landscape of ash and char and the shapes of things that had once been alive. The settlement took him in because they had no choice. A 10-year-old orphan could not be left to die, even if no family wanted the burden of another mouth to feed. He was given a corner in the church, then a cot in a widow's shed, then eventually a lean-to behind the general store, where he could sleep in exchange for sweeping the floors and hauling freight. He was fed enough to survive, clothed enough to not freeze, and otherwise forgotten by a community that had its own problems and considered him someone else's responsibility. Emmett did not forget. He could not forget. Every night he saw the fire in his dreams, saw his mother's face as she tried to shield his sisters, saw his father's back as he ran toward a gap in the flames that closed before he reached it, Every night he woke gasping, smelling smoke that was not there, feeling heat that existed only in his memory. And every day he thought about what could have saved them, what shelter might have protected them, what structure could have stopped the fire that nothing had stopped. He found the cave in the autumn of 1888, 3 months after the fire that orphaned him. He was exploring the ridge above the valley, looking for nothing in particular, simply walking, because walking was better than sitting still with his thoughts. The cave entrance was hidden by undergrowth, barely visible, a dark opening in the mountainside that most people would have walked past without noticing. Emmett did not walk past. He pushed through the brush and entered the darkness and found himself in a space that changed everything. The cave was large. The main chamber was perhaps 50 feet deep and 30 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. Smaller chambers branched off the main space, some large enough to hold a family, others barely more than alcoves. A natural spring seeped from a crack in the back wall, providing water that was cool and clean. The air was fresh, circulating through cracks and fissures that Emmett could not see but could feel as a gentle movement against his skin. And the temperature was cool. Not cold, not uncomfortable, but cool, the steady 55 degrees that the deep earth maintained regardless of what the surface was doing. Emmett stood in that cave and thought about fire, thought about heat, thought about the difference between the inferno that had killed his family and the cool stone that surrounded him now. If his family had been in this cave when the fire came, they would have lived. The fire could not reach them here. The heat could not penetrate the stone. The smoke could not fill a space that had its own ventilation, its own circulation, its own supply of clean air from somewhere deep in the mountain. They would have walked out after the fire passed, singed but alive, survivors instead of victims. Emmett began working on the cave the next day. He had no plan, no training, no resources except his own labor and the determination that grief had forged into something unbreakable. He started by clearing the entrance, widening it enough that people could enter easily, reinforcing the opening with stones that he carried from the creek bed below. He worked before dawn and after dark, in the hours that were not claimed by the chores that earned him food and shelter. He worked alone because no one would help him, and he did not expect anyone to help him. By his 11th birthday, Emmett had cleared the entrance and cut a path from the valley floor. He widened the opening enough for people to enter quickly, reinforced it with fitted stone, explored every chamber and passage until he knew the cave the way he had known his family's cabin. Access first. Everything else depended on access. The summer he turned 12, he began lining walls. Each stone was fitted against its neighbors the way he had seen masons work, creating surfaces that were smooth and stable. The raw cave walls had been irregular, dangerous in the dark, wasteful of space. The stone lining created order, created usable area, created the thermal mass that would keep the interior cool when fire heated the mountainside around it. Cyrus Blackwood noticed the project in the summer of 1890, 2 years after Emmett had begun. Blackwood owned the lumber mill that employed most of the men in the valley, and he considered any labor not directed toward his profit to be labor wasted. He climbed to the cave one afternoon, watched Emmett fitting stones into place, and rendered his verdict in a voice loud enough to carry across the mountainside. "The orphan is building himself a cave to hide in," Blackwood announced to the men who had accompanied him. A cave lined with stones, as if the mountain might collapse without his help. He could be earning wages at my mill, contributing to the community, but instead he plays with rocks like a child. The boy is simple in the head. The fire must have cooked whatever brains he had. The laughter echoed off the mountainside. Emmett heard it, but did not respond. He had learned that arguing with powerful men accomplished nothing, that the only argument that mattered was the argument of results. The fire would come again. Fires always came again in these mountains. And when the fire came, the stones he was laying would speak louder than any words he could offer now. Ventilation nearly defeated him. Fire consumes oxygen. Fire produces smoke. A sealed cave might survive the flames, only to suffocate everyone inside. Emmett spent months observing how air moved through the cave, feeling for currents, burning green wood at the entrance, and watching where the smoke went. He found the sources of fresh air, cracks and fissures high on the mountainside where smoke could not reach. He built baffles with stone, channels that directed airflow, positions for wet cloth filters that could catch embers and ash. By the time he turned 13, he had solved the hardest problem: how to keep people breathing while fire consumed all the air above. Somewhere around his 14th birthday, Emmett stopped thinking about himself alone. He expanded the stone lining into smaller chambers, creating spaces where families could shelter, where children could sleep, where the elderly could rest away from the crowding of the main hall. When he calculated capacity, the number surprised him. 100 people, maybe more if they pressed close. 100 souls who would die in a fire on the surface, but might live in the cave he was building. Then came stockpiling. Water in stone-lined basins. Food in sealed containers. Blankets, bandages, everything that 100 people might need while trapped underground for days. Emmett traded labor for goods, worked extra hours, accepted charity from merchants who pitied the orphan with his strange obsession. He prepared for a disaster that everyone said would never happen, that everyone said proved he had never recovered from the trauma that had made him. In the spring of 1894, 6 years after he had first entered the cave, Emmett sealed the last gap and tested every system. The refuge was complete. He was 16 years old, with no family, no money, no prospects except the labor that kept him fed. But he had built something that would save lives when the fire came. The fire came in August of 1894. It came the same way the fire of 1888 had come, on a summer so dry that the forest was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Lightning struck the ridge to the north, and within hours the glow was visible from the valley floor. And within days the fire had grown into something that old-timers said they had never seen before. Multiple ridges burning simultaneously. Flames visible from 20 miles away. Smoke so thick that noon looked like dusk, and the sun was a red disk that you could stare at without squinting. The evacuation order came on August 15th. The territorial governor sent word that the valley was to be abandoned, that everyone was to flee to the railroad depot 30 miles south, that the fire could not be stopped, and the only safety was distance. Wagons loaded with possessions clogged the road out of the valley. Families abandoned homes they had built over decades, livestock they could not take, everything that could not be carried at speed. But the road outclosed before everyone could leave. The fire jumped the river south of town, cutting the only escape route, trapping over 100 people in a valley that was about to become an inferno. The smoke was already thick enough to make breathing difficult. The heat was already intense enough to make standing outdoors painful. And the fire was moving toward them at a speed that left no time for another route. No time for anything except finding shelter and praying it would be enough. Emmett did not pray. He climbed onto the porch of the general store and shouted over the chaos. "The cave. Follow me to the cave. It will hold everyone. The stone will protect us. Follow me now." The crowd hesitated. They knew about the orphan's cave. They had laughed about it for 6 years. They had called him simple, called his project pointless, called his obsession proof that the fire had damaged his mind. Now he was telling them to trust their lives to the hole in the mountainside that they had mocked for as long as they could remember. Cyrus Blackwood pushed to the front of the crowd. His face was red with heat and fear and anger. The anger of a man who was not accustomed to being trapped, not accustomed to having no solution to a problem. "You expect us to follow you into a cave?" Blackwood demanded. "To seal ourselves underground while the fire burns above? We will suffocate. We will cook. Your cave is not a shelter. It is a tomb." Emmett looked at him. The man who had called him simple. The man who had said the fire had cooked his brains. The man who had laughed loudest when others laughed at the orphan's endless labor. "Then stay here," Emmett said. "Stay here and see if the surface is kinder than the stone." He turned and began walking toward the mountain. For a long moment, no one followed. The crowd stood frozen, torn between the fear of the cave and the fear of the fire, uncertain which death was more certain. Ruth Brennan moved first. She was a widow with 3 children, a woman who had slipped Emmett bread when he looked too thin, who had never joined the laughter even if she had not understood his project. She gathered her children and followed Emmett up the path, and once she moved, others moved too. First a trickle, and then a flood. Families and individuals, and eventually almost everyone in the trapped crowd, following the orphan toward the shelter he had spent 6 years building. Cyrus Blackwood was among the last to follow. He followed because the alternative was staying alone, while everyone else fled, because even his pride could not survive the terror of the fire that was now visible on the ridge above the valley, crowning through the timber, moving faster than anything he had ever seen. The cave entrance was barely visible through the smoke. Emmett had wet cloths ready, distributed them to cover mouths and noses, directed people through the entrance and into the main chamber where the air was still clear. 103 people filed into the mountain, children carried by parents, elderly supported by younger relatives, everyone pressing through the stone doorway that Emmett had built when he was 10 years old and too small to lift the larger rocks without help. The last person entered as the fire reached the ridge above the cave. Emmett sealed the entrance with the stone blocks he had prepared, creating a barrier that embers could not penetrate. He activated the ventilation filters. Wet cloth stretched across the intake channels, blocking smoke while allowing air to flow. He checked the water supply, the food stockpile, the medical supplies. Everything was ready. Everything was exactly as he had prepared it over 6 years of labor. The fire passed over them like a wave. Through cracks in the entrance barrier, Emmett could see the orange glow of flames, could hear the roar of the firestorm consuming the forest above. The temperature in the cave rose slightly as the mountainside heated, but the massive thermal mass of the stone lining absorbed the heat, kept the interior comfortable, kept the air cool enough to breathe easily. The ventilation system worked as designed, bringing fresh air from the high fissures, exhausting stale air through channels that the fire could not reach. They spent 6 days underground. 6 days while the fire burned across 3 counties, consuming over 200,000 acres of timber, destroying every structure in Spruce Valley, killing 37 people who had not found adequate shelter. 6 days of crowding and rationing and fear, of children crying and adults praying, and everyone wondering if the fire would ever end. But no one in the cave died. No one suffocated. No one cooked. The stone lining that Emmett had spent 6 years building held the heat at bay, kept the interior cool, provided exactly the protection he had designed it to provide. The water supply lasted. The food supply lasted. The air stayed clean. The cave did everything Emmett had built it to do. On the morning of the 7th day, the fire had passed and the smoke had cleared enough to open the entrance. Emmett removed the stone blocks and led the survivors out into a world transformed. The forest was gone. The valley was ash. Every building, every tree, every fence and barn and home that had stood before the fire was now char and rubble. The landscape looked like something from a nightmare, gray and black and utterly dead. But every soul who had followed him into the mountain walked out alive. 103 people who would have suffocated or burned or fled into a firestorm that would have consumed them emerged from Emmett's cave into the aftermath of the worst fire in Colorado history. Cyrus Blackwood emerged blinking into the sunlight, his expensive clothes ruined, his face streaked with soot, his pride broken by 6 days of depending on the orphan he had mocked. He looked at the destruction, looked at the cave entrance, looked at Emmett, who stood apart watching the survivors take in what had happened. Blackwood opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. What could he say? He had called the cave a tomb. It had been a womb. He had called Emmett simple. Emmett had been the only one who understood what was coming. He walked away without speaking, down the mountain toward the ash that had been his lumber mill, toward the ruins of the business that had made him wealthy and powerful and certain that he knew better than orphans who played with rocks. Others spoke. Ruth Brennan, her children still clinging to her dress, found Emmett and took his hands and said words that came out as sobs, gratitude too large for language. Other families followed, surrounding him with thanks he did not know how to accept, praise that embarrassed him because he had not built the cave for praise. He had built it because fire had killed his family, and he refused to let fire kill anyone else if he could prevent it. The settlement rebuilt in the years that followed, not in the same location, but lower in the valley, farther from the timber that had fueled the disaster. The cave became part of the community's emergency plan, maintained and supplied, and ready for the next fire that everyone now understood would eventually come. Emmett was offered money, land, opportunities that he had never expected, but he accepted only enough to build a small cabin near the cave entrance, where he could continue maintaining the refuge that had become his life's purpose. He never married. He never accumulated wealth. He never became important by any measure that Cyrus Blackwood would have recognized. He simply lived beside the cave he had built, maintaining its systems, improving its capacity, preparing for fires that came twice more in his lifetime, and each time found the cave ready to shelter those who needed it. Emmett Cole died in the winter of 1942 at the age of 64. He was found in his cabin by a neighbor who had come to check on him, seated in his chair by the fire, looking out the window toward the cave entrance that was visible through the trees. He was buried on the ridge above the cave, in a spot he had chosen years before, where he could continue watching over the shelter that had been his answer to the fire that had taken everything from him. The cave still exists. The stone lining that Emmett began placing as a 10-year-old orphan still holds back the raw rock, still provides the thermal mass that keeps the interior cool, still protects the space that has sheltered people through 4 major fires since 1894. The ventilation system has been improved with modern materials, and the water supply has been supplemented with storage tanks. But the basic design is unchanged because the basic design works. Visitors come sometimes, people interested in fire science or emergency preparedness or the history of a 10-year-old who turned grief into engineering. They walk through the chambers that Emmett dug and lined and reinforced over 6 years of solitary labor. They touch the stone walls and try to imagine placing each rock by hand year after year, while the community laughed and the powerful mocked, and no one believed it would ever matter. At the entrance, carved into a stone that Emmett placed in his 17th year, the year after the fire that vindicated everything, there are 2 numbers, just numbers, nothing else, 6 and 6. The visitors ask what they mean, and the guide tells them. 6 years to build, 6 days of shelter, the arithmetic of survival.